Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second part of our Pawn Endgame practicum, in which I give you 10 challenging exercises to test your understanding of the ideas and concepts that I outlined in the 5 instructional Pawn Endgame videos, and then carefully present the solutions in this and the previous video. So a lot of you might notice that this is indeed a re-recording of this very same video, which I initially put out 2 days ago, upon which I realized that it sounded like a video from the early 2000s. The audio quality was terrible. And because, I put a lot of effort into preparing these videos, I want the final product to be as pleasant to listen to as possible. I just want to say how much I appreciate people's understanding. Everybody was super kind, but there's nothing wrong with expecting a solid final product. There's a lot of things you could be doing and watching. You could be watching House of Dragon or Peaky Blinders or Sunday Night Football, and I greatly appreciate that you decide to watch these videos. They're long. They can be hard to listen to. And my brand is to strive for perfection in every video. So it really is not a problem to be re-recording this. I moved into a different room with less echo. I positioned my mic a lot closer to me. And even though I don't think this is going to be quite as good as when I record from my home in Charlotte, hopefully the audio quality is going to be better. I'm keeping my fingers crossed. And once again, I greatly appreciate this community. I know that people wouldn't have a problem if I left the initial recording up, but I'm also taking this opportunity, I think, to make the final product better and to actually improve the quality of the analysis as well. So without further ado, let us jump in. I'm going to switch scenes here. And I remind you that in the description to this video, you will find 2 links. The first is to the puzzles. It's a link to a Lichess study. And the second link is to the fully worked out and written out solutions. And the way I recommend to watch this video is to first attempt the problems yourself. You can make moves directly on the Lichess study, or you can download them and solve them in whichever PGN viewer you prefer. Then I recommend that you watch this video carefully, and then you can review the written out solutions at your leisure and analyze with an engine if that's what you prefer. But if you just want to view this as a regular instructional video, if you don't really want to do the puzzles on your own, that's also totally fine. And I think you can extract a lot of instructional value just from watching me present the solutions. And I will still try to work in a couple of puzzles in the video itself. I'll tell you to pause at various points. So whichever way you want to do this is totally acceptable. And the last thing I'll remind you of is that the puzzles are indeed very challenging. So don't feel like if you don't get 5 out of 5 correct, that you somehow haven't paid attention to the instructional videos. These are meant not only to help you repeat and sort of rehearse the concepts that I presented, but also to help you deepen your understanding of them. So there's going to be some new concepts that are talked about in these puzzles as well. So let's jump into the actual solutions. Our first puzzle comes from a game between 2 strong grandmasters, Dutch GM John van der Wiel and Filipino legendary grandmaster Eugenio Torre, played black. And in this position, it is white to move. So as a diligent student of pawn endgames, the first thing you should notice is really the positioning of the kings. The kings are locked in a life or death battle for territory in the center. And the proper terminology to describe this is mutual Zugzwang, which is a situation in which both sides want the other side to be the one to move their king. And if that happens, then one of the sides loses their crucial pawn. If black has to move his king, he loses d4. If white moves his king, he loses e4. And in both cases, the other side has a deadly extra passed pawn. So another way to put this is that the kings are occupying corresponding squares, which are squares of mutual Zugzwang. So normally when that happens, the battle transitions to waiting moves. Both sides start to exhaust their waiting moves, and the side that exhausts their waiting moves last induces Zugzwang, forces the opponent to move their king, and wins the game. All of that sounds simple, and it might therefore seem that white should just push a random pawn and start exhausting his waiting moves. But that doesn't tell the whole story. If you look carefully, you will notice that black actually has a deadly threat. If white just makes a random waiting move, such as a6, black is going to respond with a move c6 to c5, defending his passed pawn on d4, and taking waiting moves largely out of the equation. With the pawn protected, black can now move his king to f4, but in addition to that, white will exhaust his waiting moves first. So you simply cannot allow black to play c5. For example, let's say white plays b3, black can play g5, g4, h6, and clearly white is the one who has to move his king and lose the e4 pawn. So the first move can be arrived at largely without too much calculation. You have to play the move b2 to b4 to isolate the d4 pawn and prevent black from pushing c5. Now the waiting game begins in earnest. Black responds with the move a6, exhausting his only waiting move on the queen side, and now the battle transitions to the king side. Now, white's next move can be arrived at by process of elimination. Right? You have to be very, very careful about how you push these kingside pawns. And it turns out that pushing your g-pawn loses the game immediately. g4 is the worst move in the position because it allows black to deep freeze white's pawns with g5. White has no more moves and white is in Zugzwang. g3 is a little bit more resilient, but here black can win with h6, creating a very nasty scenario in which whichever pawn white pushes on the king side, black simply pushes the same pawn and induces Zugzwang. h4, h5, or g4, g5. We already talked about this scenario. In both cases, white is in Zugzwang. So the only logical move is actually to push your h-pawn, leaving yourself with a maximum amount of waiting moves with the g-pawn. Now, if black responds with h5, then everything is very simple. We play g3, and now it is black who is in Zugzwang and has to move his king back. Of course, black should instead play h6, following the rule that you should never exhaust more than one waiting move when possible. So black plays h6. And now white's best move is g2, g4, creating the same exact scenario where, black pushes a pawn, we push the opposite pawn forward, freezing the kingside pawns and inducing Zugzwang. So now it might seem like the game is simply over. Black plays g5, white plays h5, and black has to move his king. And kudos to you if you were able to reach this position in your calculations. But if you force yourself to carry on, you might notice that the game is far from over. Because yes, black is technically in Zugzwang, but that in itself doesn't always mean that the side which is in Zugzwang can resign. And if you calculate further, you will see that black has this move, king f4. Black can go after the g4 pawn. And after king takes d4, king takes g4, white hits a major problem. If white plays e5, black doubles back to f5, stopping the e-pawn, but most importantly, the move king d5, which would assist the further progress of the e-pawn, is now not possible. So it may seem patently obvious that black is now just winning. Black is just going to start pushing his g-pawn. The pathway is clear. And if white dips back with his king, he loses the e5 pawn. And this is where white has an absolutely brilliant resource. Now, the first thing which may come to mind is the logical move king c5. Maybe you can try to create a passed pawn on the queen side, and this is indeed a way to save the game. After king takes c5, king takes c6, we get into a pawn race, g4, b5. This is an easy breakthrough. Black plays a takes b5, white pushes a6, and you will notice that the pawns promote simultaneously. White promotes first, black promotes next, and this is just a dead draw. White can win the h6 pawn, or white can take the b5 pawn, but there are no skewers available, so the game ends in a draw. But if we rewind to the critical position after e5, king f5, white actually has a winning move. And major kudos to you if you were able to find the brilliant pawn breakthrough b4, b5, putting the pawn on pre two different ways. Now, the moment this move is played, its intention should become immediately clear to you. And I will say that it is also possible, just the same exact thing, it's possible to play the move on the previous move. But I think for greater effect, we will start with e5 and follow up with b5. If black plays a takes b5, then everything is simple. This is just a traditional pawn breakthrough. White promotes the a pawn. But if black plays c takes b5, the secondary point becomes clear. You have paved the way for white's king to reach this crucial d5 square, allowing the further progress of white's passed e-pawn. And I think this really calls forth the concept that pawn breakthroughs aren't only carried out in order to create passed pawns. That's the main reason. But in the previous video on advanced concepts, we talked about alternate uses of pawn breakthroughs. You can also break through or sacrifice your pawns in order to generate important squares for your king, or in order to favorably modify the pawn structure in some other way. So remember to think of pawn breakthroughs a little bit more broadly, right? You can sacrifice for squares, you can sacrifice for passed pawns, you can sacrifice to change the pawn structure, and this is a great application of that. But still, the game is not over, because you might notice that if black pushes either the b or the g pawn, the pawns actually promote simultaneously. So let's consider both of these options. If black plays b4, white pushes e6, and this is what I really love about this example, black can promote either one of two pawns, and in both cases, white has a little sequence to win black's newly minted queen. Here, it's all very simple. e7, b2, e8, b1, and you should notice that the king and the queen are aligned diagonally. In the pawn race video, I advised you to never stop calculating just because the pawns promote simultaneously. You can't just assume that the game ends in a draw. You have to keep calculating, and mainly you have to check whether you can win your opponent's queen with a skewer, and here you can do just that with queen g6 check, and you pick up the queen on b1. Now, I will add that if black tries to stop the progress of white's pawn with king f6, then we advance our king to d6. We've talked about this scenario at length in the pawn race video, and here you might say, well, black can now promote the b pawn and there's no more skewer on g6. But now there's a checkmate on f8. Just look at this mating construction. The h5 pawn is the unsung hero of this entire procedure because it guards the g6 square, or it anchors that square for white's queen. I might say, okay, well, no problem, I get it. What if black pushes his other pawn? What if black pushes the g pawn? Well, here you should already recognize a certain scenario unfolding after e6, g3, e7, g2, e8, g1. Again, the pawns promote simultaneously, but again, we see the king and the queen on adjacent files, which is often a precursor to a skewer, as it is in fact here. The kings are in opposition, which is very important. Black's king has no access to squares on the e file, so we just give a check on f7, push the king to the g file, and skewer the king in one of three ways, picking up black's new queen and winning the game. So black has, one could say, three separate ways to carry on in this position. After e5, b5, and king d5, black can promote the b pawn, the g pawn, or black can try to advance the king back to f6 and stop the progress of white's b pawn. But all three of these ways get punished in three separate ways. Two skewers, and in the case of king f6, black actually gets checkmated on f6. So just a brilliant illustration, not only of waiting moves, which is sort of the first part of this game, but then of the alternate uses of the pawn breakthrough. Here, white breaks through in order to generate a key square for his king. So hopefully you enjoyed this first puzzle. On we go to our next puzzle, which comes from a really old game between two very weak players. Lasker, former world champion, and Tarrasch, who was one of the defining figures of the early 20th century. He formulated a lot of positional theory that we now take for granted. We very much stand on the shoulders of giants when it comes to our chess understanding. And you know, I looked through a lot of pawn endgames from the early 1900s, and there were a lot of mistakes. You know, pawn endgame theory and endgame theory in general wasn't very well developed. Principles weren't always well understood, even by the leading players. But in this endgame, Lasker really comes through with a clutch sequence of moves to save the game. Now, you might hear me say that save the game, and you might say, well, that's kind of absurd. White is the one who's got the outside passer here. And we've been through this before. You might say, well, this is a classic scenario in which white has to use the h-pawn to distract black's king, and then leisurely walk white's own king to the queen side and just eliminate all of black's pawns. We have plenty of pawns of our own on the queen side. But, you know, it's very important to look at this position more concretely and to ask yourself whether black actually has a queenside threat. And if you ask yourself that, you will notice that, in fact, black does have a very nasty queenside threat. If white plays a neutral move, such as king f7, black is going to push c4. I might say, well, after bc, the b2 pawn is deep freezing black's pawns. But that's very untrue. In the pawn breakthrough video, I talked about the gap-toothed pawn formation, where you have pawns on disjointed files like A and C or B and D, and you push one of them in order to create a passer on the other side. You push the C pawn, then the A pawn becomes the passer, or you push the A pawn and the C pawn becomes the passer. Here, of course, the C pawn is more further advanced. So after something like H4, black pushes C3, breakthrough, BC, A4, and black has an unstoppable passed pawn on A4, and white is not fast enough if white pushes the C pawn. Black, unfortunately, promotes first and stops the C pawn easily. And if in this position, white plays h5, black steps to g5 and stops the h-pawn with his king. In both cases, white loses the game. So it's clear from this calculation that white will have to use the h-pawn as a decoy. White has to distract black's king from f5, and white has to make a beeline for his side of the board. Otherwise, there's no way you're going to have a chance to stop black from queening one of his queenside pawns. So the only logical first move is, in fact, h2, h4. Now, black's response is forced. White threatens the move h5. So if black doggedly carries on with c4, then after bc, h5, everything is very easy. In fact, after c3, white is the only one with winning chances. a4, h6, we have simultaneous promotion, and white is an extra c pawn, so white can try to play for a win here. So, of course, rewinding back to the position after white's first move, black will play king f5 to g4, stopping white's h-pawn. And this leads us to the critical moment of this example. So it might seem, once again, totally obvious that the correct move is king f6. Like I said, we have to make a beeline for the queen side, and this is the mathematically fastest way to do that. But chess is not always a game that abides by, neat rules of mathematics. And if we calculate this on, you will notice that after c4, bc, bc, it looks like white is about to stop black's pawns, but we're one tempo short. c3, that breakthrough again, bc a4, and amazingly, after king d4 a3, white's very own c3 pawn stops the king from stopping the a pawn. Mathematically, white is fast enough, but because you have this darned pawn on c3, black pawn still promotes. And this is a very common theme in a lot of pawn endgame compositions or studies. And here it prevents the white king from stopping black's pawn. So amazingly, the totally natural move king f6 actually loses the game. We have to find an alternate route. But there seems to be no alternate route. I mean, f6 e5 seems to be the only way to access the queen side. Well, in order to understand the brilliance of Lasker's idea, it is helpful to look at another example. This is perhaps the most famous pawn endgame of all time. I didn't really get around to showing you this in one of the instructional videos. A lot of you will immediately recognize this position. It is a composition. It is a composed position by Richard Redi, who was one of the leading players of the 20th century, but he was also an endgame theoretician. He developed a lot of modern understanding, and most famously, he composed this incredibly paradoxical position. And if you're seeing this for the first time, you're really in for a treat. So he composed this, I think, in the 1920s. It is white to move, and white's goal is to draw the game. Now, if you say this at a party, you might get laughed out of the building. Draw the game. Black has an h-pawn that's 1,000 steps away from white's king, while white's pawn is totally condemned. If you play c7, black easily stops the pawn with king b7. But amazingly, it turns out that white can use the c-pawn as a bargaining chip to gain the tempi that he needs to stop black's h5 pawn. So to stop this pawn, how many tempi do we need to gain? Well, we need king g7, king f6, and king e5. We need to gain 3 tempi. So we start by playing the move king g7. Here's tempo number 1. Of course, black responds by pushing the pawn to h4. And there's the rub. If white just goes in a straight line, black obviously just promotes with h3. But white takes a diagonal route. We chart a course to f6. And there lies the rub. If black stubbornly pushes the pawn, all of a sudden the king doubles back toward the center, king e6, supporting the c-pawn and allowing it to promote simultaneously. For example, king b6, we go king d7. h2, c7, pawns promote simultaneously, and black does not have a win. Queen h3 check, the king is able to keep in contact with the queen. This is a draw. So you might say, well, no problem. Black has a lot of tempi to spare, so after king f6, we're just going to go king b6 and eliminate this pawn preemptively. But now the white king continues its diagonal route, king to e5. And this actually is a double attack. White threatens to stop the pawn with king f4, gaining that third tempo. White also threatens to advance the king to d6, supporting the path of the c-pawn. And there's nothing that black can do about both threats. If black takes c6, then white doubles back to f4, stopping the h-pawn. And if black plays h3, we've been through this before. White plays king d6, h2, c7, and all is well under the sun. Both pawns promote simultaneously. So amazingly, this actually is a drawable position. White takes the diagonal route, using his passed pawn as a decoy to find the most efficient way to stop black's h-pawn. This is the famous Redi study, and you definitely should be familiar with it if you are, a diligent student of the endgame. Okay, so hopefully you're able to kind of see the connection. Here you can do something very, very similar, where you use this h4 pawn as a decoy, and rather than going king f6, the only drawing move is actually king to g6. King to g6, threatening to play h5, much like in the Redi study, forcing black to take on h4, and now you have a more efficient pathway to the queen side. You go king f5. And if you compare this to the line where the white king is on f6, after c4, bc, bc, here the king moved back to e5, but now it can move back to e4. And after c3, bc, a4, the king simply circumvents this obstacle on c3. We play king d3, a3, king c2, and not only does white stop the pawn, here white actually wins the game because white has this additional c3 pawn. So incidentally, in order to draw Already in this position, black is the one who's got to be very careful. I'm pretty sure the only way to draw is to move black's king to the g file, but that's outside the scope of the video. Tarrasch obviously realized what was going on, and he immediately acquiesced to the inevitable, and he decided that he's going to force a draw by playing king g3. Now white's king smoothly makes its way to the queen side, eliminating all of black's pawns one after the other. Gobble, gobble, king d5, king e3, king takes e5, and it actually is black who has to be accurate here. King d2, king takes b5, and black is the one who draws by the skin of his teeth with king c2, king takes a5, and of course, king takes b3. Tarrasch avoids the last trap. Taking this pawn would be a pretty bad idea indeed because of b4. So again, this is not a one-to-one similarity with a ready study, but hopefully you're able to see the conceptual similarity. You go, rather than going king f6, which seems to be the most efficient path, you actually use the h-pawn in order to generate a more efficient path to the queen side with this move, king to g6. Okay, on we go to our next example. And this will just take me a second. I need to copy this into my chess.com study. So just a moment here. Okay, there we go. And back we go to the initial position. Okay. So this next example comes from another game between two strong grandmasters. The player who has the white pieces needs no introduction. This is Viktor Kortschnoj. And on the black side is a very strong Hungarian GM, recently died, Gyula Sax. And it is black to play in this position. So you should notice pretty early on that there is a striking similarity to our first exercise. In our first exercise, if we rewind back to the initial position, we have this battle for territory in the king side, and in the center in the situation of mutual Zugzwang. And here we have something very similar. If we flip the board, black can actually orchestrate the same exact scenario by playing the natural move king to e5. This virtually forces white to play king d3, and we have an almost identical scenario to our first exercise, where both sides start to exhaust their waiting moves and hope to force the opponent to be the one to move their king. Now, in comparison to our first example, here black has an abundance of waiting moves on the queen side. Black has doubled a-pawns, which hamstrings his ability to create a passed pawn, but does add an incredible amount of waiting moves. Black can play the move a3, and then has actually 3 waiting moves with this other a-pawn. That is a massive asset in a situation like this. So it's worth starting with a move like g5 in order to prevent white from pushing f4 and dislodging black's king from the d4 pawn. But keep this idea in mind. It seems like black wins in elementary fashion. In fact, this is what Sax played. Kortschnoj plays f3. If white plays g3, then it's even worse. Black just deep freezes white's pawns with g4, and this is immediate Zugzwang after like a3, a5. So Kortschnoj plays f3, Sax plays a3, freezing white's remaining queenside pawn, g3, and of course a6 or a5, doesn't even matter. Sax played a5. Black has waiting moves to spare, also with the f-pawn, and it seems like the game is over. White has to play g4. Black plays either f6 or a4, pushing the king away from d3, and although black cannot take on e4 directly, black can head for f4 and eliminate white's remaining kingside pawns, winning the game easily. But here, it's very important not to forget a detail. After a5, white is not actually forced to play g4, and this is what Sax overlooked when he played the move king e5. Kudos to you if you were able to see that white actually can play the move f4 check. And this is, again, why you shouldn't just calculate waiting moves in this mechanical fashion. You should remember that your opponent can actually modify the pawn structure to his favor. f4 dislodges black's king from the d4 pawn, and forces an immediate draw. Because after gf, king takes f4, king takes d4, you get a situation in which white is not going to lose control over the e4 pawn, and if the e4 pawn is traded for the f pawn, then it doesn't actually even matter if black is the first one to get to the a2 pawn, because black has corner pawns, which means that as long as white ensures that he can reach the c2 square when black takes on a2, that's a theoretical draw that I've talked about in previous videos. And white draws in many different ways here. For example, let's say black plays f6, right? Trying to shoulder white's king away from d4. Opposition doesn't matter here. White plays king d5. Black plays king e3. Again, yes, congratulations, you've shouldered white's king away from the e-pawn. But white draws in one of many ways. Just king e6 is the simplest way. King takes e4, king takes f6. And now white pursues the black king into the corner, as we've done so many times in these videos. King b2, king d3, king takes a2, king c2, and of course this is a well-known theoretical draw. It doesn't matter how many a-pawns are on the board. You might say, oh, black can play a4 and this is Zugzwang, but white just drops back to c1 and then goes to b1. And again, doesn't matter how many corner pawns black has. This is a very well-known theoretical draw. Black has to start giving away a pawns in order to avoid stalemate. So let's rewind back to this position before we tried f6. If black plays king f3 instead, it's also just a dead draw. White can play king e5, king e3, king f5, king d3, and now the simplest just to push this pawn at e5, threatening king f6. Black can't really go to c3. Black has to go to d4, and now just king f6, then king takes f7, and again, white just pursues black's king into the corner. Doesn't matter how you slice it, this is just a dead draw. So amazingly, the ridiculously natural move, king d6 to e5, relinquishes the win. And this is why you should be so careful about over-trusting your intuition in pawn endgames. Your intuition will often suggest that you should move the king into the most natural square. But the specifics of the position will often dictate that another course should be taken, and this is a great illustration of that. The best move, the only winning move in this position, is actually to go the other way, to move the king to c5. And the whole point is that after white plays king d3, the move f2, f4 no longer comes with check. So now it no longer dislodges black's king from the c5 square. And that means that black actually can win the waiting game and actually induce Zugzwang. So how does this work? Well, once again, black should start by playing g5. You should try to choose waiting moves that simultaneously deprive your opponent of his or her waiting moves, right? You shouldn't just choose indiscriminately. This prevents white from pushing f4, so it's the most strategic waiting move. Once again, g3, g4 loses on the spot, so white should play the move f3. And now you follow the same principle. The best move is a3 to prevent white from pushing his a-pawn. White plays g3, the waiting game continues, as it did with the king on e5. Black pushes a6, very important not to play a5, exhaust only one waiting move at a time. White plays f4, and this is where this move no longer comes with check. So after gf, gf, black can simply continue the waiting game with a5, and white is already in Zugzwang. No matter how white pushes these pawns, white creates a hole. If white plays e5, he creates a hole on d5, and black wins immediately, pushing the king away from d3 and infiltrating e4. And if white pushes f5, then the hole on e5 is created. Black secures the hole by playing f6. Now, obviously, the breakthrough fails. e5, f takes e5, f6, king d6, and black easily stops the pawn. And if white doubles back to d2, then black migrates the king over to e5, king d6. Now you might say, wait a second, these are corresponding squares on d3 and e5. White's not just going to step onto d3 and allow Zugzwang, but it doesn't matter. Waiting moves allow you to hack the concept of corresponding squares. You can actually step onto your corresponding square if you have more waiting moves than your opponent, because after king d3, black exhausts his final waiting move, just a beautiful sequence, and forces white's king away from d3. This is Zugzwang, and white loses both of his remaining kingside pawns and loses the game. So just an incredible sequence, and every one of these moves has to be played accurately. If you play a5 here, then if we go down this line after f6, f5, you don't have that additional waiting move. Here you exhaust your final waiting move, and this is a draw. Because after king e2, if you move up to c4, then you allow the breakthrough e5, and white actually wins. F takes e5, f6, the pawn is unstoppable. So after king d6, of course, white just circles around. And if you step onto e5, once again, you lose the game. You don't have that additional waiting move. So notice how razor thin the margins are between being winning and being losing. There's often no middle ground. You have to be accurate. So if we rewind back to this position, white can also try to go the other way, play the move a3, but this loses in similar fashion. Black advances the pawn to g4, continuing to try to prevent white from making waiting moves, so g4. And after f3, here you need to be accurate for one more move. G takes f3 relinquishes the win. After g takes f3, a6, f4, we get a very similar scenario. f6, f5, and black once again has to exhaust his final waiting move, and we already know that this is a draw. So instead, pause the video and see if you can figure out an improvement. What should black do here? If not, g takes f3. Well, hopefully you were able to determine that the correct move is in fact g3. And of course, this works because it forces white to exhaust his waiting moves first. White has no choice but to play f4. And now we win in similar fashion. a6, f5, f6. And actually, the presence of these two additional pawns does not matter at all. They don't change the nature of the position. King e2, king d6, and black wins with a familiar procedure, a5, and this is Zugzwang. One other thing I will add is that white can defend a little bit more resiliently by moving the king back to d2 first. Black plays king c4, and now white can set a final trap by playing f5. Of course, the trap is that black should not play f6 here. e5 wins the game for white. Rather, black should drop the king back to c5. If e5, then the king moves into d5, and this does not work. Again, the king easily stops the pawn with king d6, and then you go e5 and king e6. And of course, if white goes king d3, then we've transposed back into the position we already talked about. Black plays f6, and Zugzwang is imminent. So that, ladies and gentlemen, is the only way that you can win this game. You have to go the counterintuitive route. You have to go to c5 rather than e5 in order to ensure that the move f4 does not come with check and that you can keep your protection of the d4 pawn. So this example not only illustrates the power of waiting moves and the way in which waiting moves can really dominate the game and dictate the result of the game, but it also shows us that you have to look at each endgame very concretely, and you cannot trust your gut instinct all of the time when it comes to deciding where to put your king. You have to try to appreciate the specifics of the position if you want to squeeze the most out of every game. Okay, so we have 2 exercises remaining, and one of them is a real doozy. It's this one, but we're going to get to this one in a moment. First, we have our penultimate exercise, which comes from a game between 2 very strong female players, Kashlinskaya and Ozturk. Now, I will mention that these last 2 examples come from a chess.com article that I wrote about 7 years ago. So if any of you happened across that article and have seen these examples, then I apologize, but I'm hopeful that in most cases, that article has fallen into obscurity. So hopefully you're seeing these for the first time. So this example is just an awesome illustration of several important principles, as well as the centrality of corresponding squares and the importance of understanding their implications. So it's white to move. And it should be clear to you just from a couple of cursory moments of looking at this example that white is playing for a win. White has the outside passer on b5. Black has a set of very vulnerable pawns on the king side, which white can try to eliminate with her king. So the first move is very obvious. This is not a trap. You start with a move king d4, attacking the e4 pawn. And everything may seem at first sight to be super straightforward. Black has no moves. King c7, king takes e4, and black is short by about 1,000,000 miles. White just eliminates the other 2 pawns. But as a keen student of the endgame, you should notice pretty quickly that black can use her pawn majority to break through on the king side and make it as difficult as possible for white to eliminate black's kingside pawns. So Ozturk correctly plays the move e3. This is the easy breakthrough, f takes e3, and f3. Now, this is a nasty turn of events for white. It may seem that black actually promotes her pawn, but in fact she doesn't. White stops the pawn with king d3. This is a worthy construction to remember. Yeah, your e3 pawn blocks the king, but if black pushes f2, then white stops the pawn with king e2. So white is not risking losing here. But white is risking losing her winning chances, because now black takes the additional time to play king c5. And, well, what's going on here? Well, clearly white needs to eliminate the f3 pawn in order to win the game. But how does white do that? Well, white has 2 ways to do that. There is sort of a more efficient method and then a less efficient method. But you should remember that efficiency isn't always the goal in pawn endgames. And you should remember that pushing unnecessary pawns, as general and meaningless as this advice might seem, can actually help you gain a lot of points. So the efficient way to win back the f3 pawn is to push the e pawn forward, creating a pathway directly to the f3 pawn. This is the direct flight. But after king takes b5, king e3, you should notice that you have yielded this very important d4 square. And now you allow black's king to shoulder you with king c4, king takes f3, and king d4. White's king is on the worst possible spot. White's very own pawns block the white king from accessing these important squares. f4 is controlled by the g5 pawn, and white has no choice but to give up the e4 pawn and therefore give up any winning chances. This is just a draw after something like e5. King takes e5, king e3, and the kings just start dancing around. This is just a dead draw. So here we see a great illustration of the fact that the fastest way to win the f3 pawn isn't actually the best way. And the best way is to leave this pawn on e3 so that it controls this very important d4 square and doesn't allow white's king to get shouldered. The only winning move is king back to d2. You take the circuitous, the roundabout route. That does not roll off the tongue. King takes b5, king e1. Black, of course, takes the opportunity to move her king back to the center. If black tries to make a beeline for d3, then black is the one who gets shouldered. King d3, king takes f3, opposition. And here opposition really is very important, because after black's king moves away, white, of course, just plays king e4 and then king f5 and eliminates the g5 pawn. So once again, Ozturk takes the most resilient continuation, king c5, king f2, king to d5, king takes f3, king e5. And we have basically reached stage 2 of this endgame. White has successfully eliminated the f3 pawn and successfully avoided getting shouldered. But now white has to find a way to use her extra pawn to actually win the game. Now, obviously, the move b4 is, once again, incredibly premature. It allows king d4, and again, the white king gets shouldered. So it's clear that white is just going to have to find some way to maneuver the king from the king side, let's say to the center, to d3, to a square that is going to allow white to push the e-pawn without getting shouldered. But it's impossible to do that properly unless you have a keen understanding of corresponding squares. And unless you have noticed that there is a key set of corresponding squares in the center that you have to avoid if you're white. And that set is the squares e2 and e4. I remind you that in the event of a set of corresponding squares, you want to be the last person, you want to be the second person to put your king on your corresponding square. If you put your king on a corresponding square first, and you don't have any waiting moves, that's the caveat, then you are the one who lands in Zugzwang, and that is indeed the case. After king e2, king e4, black puts her king in opposition, and if white goes to the left, then black goes to the right, eliminating the g4 pawn, and it's not hard to establish that after e4, king f4, not only does white lose the pawn race, white loses the game after king d4, g4. Notice that white's king is in the checking zone of the black g-pawn. Black promotes with check, while white's pawn is only on the 7th rank. Here, black wins the game. So that doesn't work. And if you go to the right side, which is relatively speaking the best continuation, then you have made no progress. And after king d5, king f3, king e5, you're right back on square one. You're right back where you started with. So as is the case in such situations, the key is to avoid stepping onto your corresponding square. You again have to take the circuitous route. You have to go through f2 to e1 to d2, taking extreme care to avoid stepping onto the e2 square, unless, of course, black is the first one to step on her corresponding square. So Kashlinskaya correctly plays in this position. Sorry, let's rewind. King f2. Ozturk circles around d5 and e5. Neither side wants to put their king on their corresponding square first. If king e4 happens, then white steps onto e2. Now black is the one in Zugzwang. And this basically reaches the position from the game. We're not going to talk about this separately. You'll see. Black plays king d5 and king f2 to e1. If you don't understand corresponding squares, this might seem like such a mysterious move. But the moment you get the concept right, this move starts to make perfect sense. I really think that's the magical thing about learning endgames, is that these things become totally demystified to you. King e1, king e5, and king d2. Black has no choice but to continue toggling between these two squares, and now white claims opposition with king d3. Again, black has to play king e5, and here we have gained a tempo in comparison to the situation where white's king is on d2 and black's king is on f3. Now white can play e4, and with that additional tempo, white actually wins the pawn race. e4, king f4, this is stage 3. Stage 3, as it often is a pawn race. King d4, king takes g4, e5. Now you might say, wait a second, after king f5, the pawns are going to promote simultaneously, but as was indeed the case in our first example, the king is going to be on the f-file, the newly minted queen is going to be on the g-file. You know what that means. That means skewer land. And that is the case here. Ozturk played king g6. This loses immediately to e6. G4, she sets a final trap. Obviously not e7. King f7 and king e8 draws. So instead, you want to make this additional move, king d6. And after g3, e7, white promotes with check and wins the game. Relatively more resilient would have been g4, but here you know the drill. e6, g3, e7, g2, queen, queen, and the final detail, queen f7 check, forcing the king onto the g-file, as we have seen so many times, and then queen g6, followed by queen takes g1. So just an incredible illustration of the power of corresponding squares. Just once again, in this position, white has to avoid the e2 square, king e1, king d2, and king d3. If black would have played king e4, and then king e5, trying to keep the opposition, White uses another concept that I outlined in the previous video, pawn-assisted opposition. White plays e4, and then steps into the pawn-assisted opposition, where the pawn controls the 2 squares on the 5th rank, forcing black's king back. And here the win is even more elementary. King d4, and then e5, and again, pawn-assisted opposition. And then white, the easiest way to win is just to eliminate the g5 pawn and then use the 2 extra pawns to win in elementary fashion. So just a very, very nice illustration of these concepts. And that brings us to our final exercise. And this is really the cherry on top. This is one of my favorite examples to show because it's so rich. And paradoxically enough, it comes from a 5-minute game that I played 8 years ago in 2014 on the Internet Chess Club. Hopefully that rings a bell, at least for some listeners. This was the precursor to chess.com. This is where people used to play. And this is where I started my online chess career. So in this game, I have the white pieces against a strong player. I think he's probably about IM strength, anonymous. He went by the username FranklinPines. And we have a pawn endgame. I think at this point, both of us had about like 45 seconds left, so not a lot of time to calculate. And the first thing that you should notice is that this is a pawn race in the making. White has a passed c5 pawn. Black has a pawn on g3. And so really, before you get your bearings, the first thing you should do is just try to calculate the move c6 and see what happens if you just blindly push your pawn toward promotion. So this move leads to a queen endgame where white is up a pawn. c6, g2, c7, black promotes first, but white promotes with check, giving white the initiative. But this, of course, jumps the gun a little bit. We haven't talked about queen endgames yet, but in queen endgames, the material count is often superseded by king activity and queen activity, as is the case really in a lot of other multi-piece endgames. And here, because of how active black's king is, and because of how weak white's pawns are, black is able to handily make the draw. So, for example, the best winning attempt for white is to keep checking, queen h3, trying to dislodge black's king from its contact with the e3 pawn, king f2, queen h4 check, but the king just toggles between f2 and f3. Now, if you take on f6, then black just takes on e3, and this is easy. So again, the most resilient attempt is queen to h5 check, forking the king in the d5 pawn and forcing the king back to f2. Might seem like after queen takes d5, white's made a great deal of progress because black can't take on e3. But what black can do is give this incredibly nasty check on b1, and white's king is caught in a cage. And as another sneak preview, a concept that we will discuss in our queen endgame videos is what's called the sundial. And the sundial is a situation where the defending side just pursues the attacking side's king and queen in a skewer formation around the board, not allowing the king to escape the roundabout. So here, black initiates the sundial with queen a2. You'll get the concept really quickly. King c5, queen a5. Wherever the white king steps, the black queen steps onto the appropriate square to keep the skewer going. White's king has to maintain contact with the queen at all times, and so cannot escape this circle of death. King c6, queen a8 check, king d6, queen d8 check, king e6, queen g8 check. Notice that the f6 pawn is controlling e5. That's kind of important. King d6, back to d8. And this is going to be a repetition of moves. Just a really, really pretty instantiation of the sundial. And if white goes to c3, then black can throw in another check on c1 and then take the pawn on e3. And white is just unable to keep control of both of these pawns. These pawns are too weak. White's king is too exposed. And the game ends in a draw, which is an unsuccessful result for white, who's trying to win. So a little bit of calculation reveals that the first move, c6, only ends in a draw. Is there an alternative to c6? Well, if you watch the pawn race video carefully, you will notice that you will remember that one of the main themes of pawn races is using your king to force your opponent's king onto an inferior position before continuing the race. And that's precisely what white can do here with the correct first move, king d3 to e2. So the point, of course, is that g2 loses on the spot. King f2, king h3, and now the very important move, king g1, getting behind the pawn. And the game is over. White promotes the c pawn. So, of course, black has to play king to h3, but now the king is on the corner of the board, which greatly increases the chance that you can force a queen trade, and that is indeed the case here. Now white pushes c6. There's no other choice. g2, c7, g1, and c8 queen. And at first sight, it might seem like the game is over. The king and the queen, again, are on adjacent files, which means that if black stays on the h file, white can just give a check on h8, and now give a check on g7, forcing the queen trade. But that's not the end of the story. Here, white has the easy breakthrough with e4, and then d5, and white just promotes the d pawn and wins the game. So this would be a nice exercise if this was all that there was to it, but it wouldn't be the final exercise of this batch. It would be probably the first one. And hopefully you were able to notice, and kudos if you were, because this is not an easy thing to conceptualize. Black can actually get a more favorable version of the pawn endgame by initiating it himself with queen g4 check. And the point, of course, is that black's king is in a much closer proximity to white's pawn majority here. The king is on g4 rather than on g1. Now, hopefully you're also able to notice that white can still break through right in black's face with the move e4. But we'll get to that in a second. If white tries to sort of shoulder black's king out of g4 with the move king f2, this is going to fail because black is going to deep freeze white's pawn majority with f5, and now white is never going to be able to break through. That just gives black a protected passer, and black's king is going to keep in close proximity to white's f pawn. So for example, king g2, king h4, and if white plays king f3, black can very safely play king h3 because e4 allows f takes e4 check. That is very important. Otherwise, white would play f5. And here, of course, white actually loses the game. So there's just no way that white can circumvent this king e2. Black, as long as black stays close to the f pawn with a move like king g4, and white has made absolutely zero progress. King f3, king d3, king f2, and here the very same principle. If e4, black unfortunately takes back with check. So this attempt does not work. Instead, e4 is the only winning attempt. You break through anyway, and the key line is d takes e4, d5. Now black is able to stop the pawn with king f5, but this is an important formation to remember. The f pawn controls e5, the d pawn controls e6, so black's king is totally locked in Zugzwang. White advances his king up to e3. This is in fact how the game continued, and black loses on the spot. The black king has to leave f5. And although white's d pawn doesn't quite promote, d6 would be very premature because of king f7, you can just pick up the e4 pawn. I mean, you're just up a pawn. Now you simply win by using the d pawn as a decoy. King f5, and then king g6, and this is, in fact, how the game ended. King d6, f5, and my opponent resigned because I'm just going to take f6 on the next move, or play d6 first, and then promote the f pawn. But let's rewind to the position after e4. If you look very carefully, you might notice that d takes e4 isn't the only move. Not only is it not the only move, it's far from the most resilient move, which is king takes f4. You eliminate the f pawn first, and after e takes d5, you are still in time to stop white's doubled passed pawns with the move king f5. If d6, then king e6 draws on the spot. And black's strategy here is going to be to wind the king around to d6 using the f pawn as a decoy. So the moment white's king reaches e4, defending d5, black is going to play f5, dislodging the king from e4, much like in the Kortschnoj Sax example. So it may seem like the game inevitably ends in a draw, and most students who I've shown this endgame to automatically consider king f3 to be white's only reasonable winning attempt. And once again, this speaks to the importance of resisting the urge just to blindly trust what your intuition is saying about the position. There's often going to be a natural move, but if you look at the position more concretely, you might often notice that it's not necessarily the correct move. So king f3 draws without a fight. Black plays king g6. White, let's say, plays king f4. Doesn't actually matter. King f7, king f5, king to e7, and that's it. White's king has reached a dead end. Black's king is going to step onto d6 on the next move, and much like I explained, if white, here black can do whatever. Black can even play king f7, but the way to force the draw is king d6, king e4, and this key move f5 check, again using the outside passer to dislodge white's king from the d5 pawn. King takes f5, king takes d5, and black eliminates the final pawn on the next move. So what's amazing about this is that the only way to win is actually to take the ridiculously counterintuitive route. You have to go to the left side rather than the right side. And you have to abide by perhaps the most important rule of pawn races, which is that you have to use your king as a weapon. You have to use your king to assist the progress of your pawns, especially in the situation where your opponent's king is trying to prevent the progress of your pawns. And the only way to assist the progress of your pawns is to do it from the left side of the board, because that's the only side that black is not controlling. And so the winning move is king e2 to d3. Diagonal opposition, but that doesn't really matter. After king g6, you don't go to e4. That leads to exactly the same scenario that we discussed. You go to c4. And the point is that after, let's see, king takes f4, he takes d5, king f5, king d3, g6, c4, black plays king f7, black tries to get to d6, but he's not in time. King to c5, king e7, and white reaches c6 just in time. Now, if black starts to push his f-pawn, black is not fast enough. King c7, f4, d6, king e6, d7, and white just promotes first and wins in elementary fashion. And most importantly, if in this position black steps back to d8, the king is now too passive. It's too far away from white's pawns. Notice the use of opposition here, restricting black's king from the 7th rank and winning the f pawn while maintaining both of white's extra pawns, which is the only way to win this position. f5, king e5. Black finally reaches d6, but now he no longer has his f-pawn, so white is able to defend both of these pawns at once and induce Zugzwang. And most importantly, you should remember that this is in fact a winning endgame, because without the d4 pawn, of course this is a theoretical draw, but with the d4 pawn, white has that waiting move, which we exploit only when we need it. In this position, you have that additional waiting move, forcing black's king out of the shell and stepping onto e7, promoting the d-pawn, right? So this is just a worthy theoretical endgame to remember, regardless of everything else in this position. So amazingly, this strategy yields victory. Now, I should point out that black has a much more resilient defensive option. Instead of stubbornly going back to f7, black should sense the danger and start pushing his f-pawn as quickly as possible. f5 is the only way to prolong the game. Now, if white plays d6, this is again premature. Black steps back to f7, and obviously white does not make it to d8 in time. So white has to burn a move on king c5, continuing to use the king for assistance. Now, if king f7, then white plays king c6, and we already talked about that. So black has to continue pushing his f-pawn, f4, d6, f3, and the pawns promote simultaneously, but white has managed to keep that extra d4 pawn. And I did plug this position into the endgame table base. This is a win for white. This is a win for white, and the way to start is queen g8 check, tossing the black king away to the h-file. Can't move to the f-file because of the skewer. And after it moves to the h-file, white pushes d5. Again, this is way outside the scope of the video. We won't discuss this endgame right now, but you can play around on table bases yourself if you want to deepen your understanding of it. White is winning, though. That you can take my word for. I did plug this position in. And for the sake of completeness, I will point out that black can also get a similar type of endgame by first playing king f7 and now pushing f4. d6, f3, d7, f2, d8, f1, but this is still a winning endgame for white. And in short, the reason this is winning, it might seem like a draw because black's king is very close to the pawn, but that's not actually a good thing. And the reason that's not a good thing is because in many cases, for example, it's a queen c1, black starts checking, you get a scenario like this, and already black is out of effective checks. Because if queen c3 check, here you can see why keeping the king in close proximity to the pawn in such positions can actually be a bad thing. It's because white can interpose with a check, forcing an obviously winning pawn endgame. So both this and the endgame with the black king on the h-file are both theoretically winning. They're not easy to convert, but they are winning. So, this exercise is in fact sound. It's accurate to say that white can win in the initial position, but I definitely had to mention this for the sake of completeness. Still, I don't think this spoils the instructive value of white's maneuver. The main pull of this exercise is that after king takes g4, you have to notice that this is the time for the breakthrough, e4. And in this position, you have to take the counterintuitive route. Once again, you don't go toward black's pawn. You go away from black's pawn, but toward your own pawns. You have to support their progress, and you do so by playing the move king d3, then king c4, king b5, and king c6, supporting the pawns from the left side. And in this way, white is able to force a win in this pawn endgame and in our final exercise. Okay, so once again, you go king e2, you force black's king onto an inferior square, then you initiate the pawn race. Black gets a favorable version of the pawn endgame, but it doesn't stop the breakthrough. If d takes e4, then black's king is zuged. After king takes f4, e d5, king f5, you have to find the correct pathway for your king. And that, ladies and gentlemen, concludes our whirlwind tour of these 5 additional exercises. Now, once again, I'm keeping my fingers very much crossed that this recording quality is going to be quite a bit higher than my first 2 takes. I'm just going to put this one up, whatever the quality is. But I just want to thank everybody once again for your understanding and for the incredible comments on these endgame videos. I know that the algorithm doesn't always spit them out because of how long they are, but that doesn't mean I don't appreciate the attentiveness and care with which people watch them and the incredibly wholesome comments that people leave. This community is awesome, and it's just a pleasure to make these instructional videos for people who are truly invested in their own improvement. I'm going to continue doing it. And on this note, we conclude our tour of pawn endgames. The next video is going to be on knight versus pawn endgames, and we're going to continue our exploration of endgames then. But for now, Hope you enjoyed the video, folks. Hope you enjoyed the exercises. Make sure to review the solutions, the written out solutions on in the description. You can click on either of the links to the Lichess studies and let me know what you think. All right, folks, I'll see you in the next video. Goodbye.